just accept it and get on with it. And no, Edel, in fairness to her, what she did, she started individual groups, certainly of the ethnic groups, but she also began mixed groups as well. So she broke new ground that missionaries themselves couldn't break by establishing mixed presidia of the Legion. And again, she had phenomenal success and traveled all around Kenya and the countries around there, Malawi, is it Zimbabwe is next to that, Uganda she went to visit too, Tanzania. She went further afield to Mauritius, down to South Africa, traveled around quite a few of the large countries in the east of Africa there. So Africa is simply an enormous continent. It's worth sitting down and actually looking at the map to get an appreciation of the scale of her journeys and her travels. Just extraordinary. So in the beginning, all her work, she traveled around. She took lifts here, there and everywhere, traveled by foot, every conceivable means of transport in Africa. And eventually she figured she needed a car, really. So the first year or two was spent getting lifts here, there and everywhere. But in 1938, the Concilium allowed her to buy a car. And because she worked in another premises where they used to maintain cars, she knew a little bit about a good buy. And so she got this Ford Coupe, which took her on. She called it her Rolls Royce, and it took her everywhere. And there's many occasions when she went through rain and flood and mud and dirt tracks, and that poor car took all kinds of abuse. One of her journeys, she had a driver who used to come around with her, Muhammad. She had a few drivers in the course of the years, and at least two of them were fond of the drink, and she had to sack a couple of them along the way because they were going everywhere, so she had to be careful. So here's a typical presidium and the Legion growing, Edel sitting there at the front and some priests and religious there, just to give you an idea that she won great support. And again, it was, I guess, her living the Legion that really people admired it and were drawn into it. Extraordinary. And here Edel, quite at ease with various priests and missionaries, and able to hold her own, just like with the men at the factory, tough but deeply religious at the same time. There she is at the front there with a typical Legion meeting, no different to any Legion meeting you might have here. So 1936 to 1940, there's just huge amount of traveling all over these vast countries, jungle and tropics and heat and all kinds of conditions. She picked up malaria along the way as well. So and together with her tuberculosis, how she survived it all is miraculous at all. But here she is recovering from illness in Malawi. That was after her trip to Mauritius as well. And you can see just from her legs how thin she was. She thought it was a good idea to go and get a portrait taken to show how good she was. But in reality, 75 pounds. She really got very ill. And you can see next to Ruby Roberts there, another Irish envoy. Ruby's in her 50s, and Edel there is only in her 30s. And you would say it was the other way around, really. She looks worn out from her work. And this was after much traveling and much visiting. So the early 1940s saw a real downturn in her health. And she spent a year or more in various hospitals trying to recover. She went to South Africa because the climate was a bit more temperate there from East Africa and Kenya. It was quite tropical there and quite difficult to live. So South Africa, the climate was better suited to her. So I've kind of flashed through very quickly her time in Africa, but really again it was much like Alfie Lambe, presidium after presidium, curia after curia, and she won the hearts of all. Not without huge opposition at the same time. Missionaries saying, look, there was never heard of that a young woman who wasn't a religious should travel the roads of Africa and the mission stations in an apostolic way. It was simply unheard of. You just wouldn't do that. So she was a pioneer, certainly in that spirit. And wherever she went, she managed to win their hearts and to begin the Legion. And again, the same workload, having to write, to keep in touch with the various presidia and curia, to return again, to visit again, see how they were doing, to keep in touch with Dublin, to keep everybody informed of what was going on, to win over the hearts of bishops and priests and missionaries. There was one occasion when there was one priest who really didn't have time for the Legion. And he kind of undermined everything Edel was trying to do. So he'd establish these groups. You get people to come together like here, And yet he'd knock it on the head all the time. And yet on one occasion there was a second priest with them, and he could see how sincere Edel was. And because this other priest was giving her such a hard time, he kind of won her heart and kind of got in the back door that way, and managed to get things going in that place through that other priest. So it was simply her perseverance that won her through. Not only that, but there was an apostolic delegate in Africa at the time, a Monsignor Riberi, and he was in Africa during those years. He's an Italian, and because the war had started in 1939, he was asked to leave Africa. Some of these countries were occupied by the English, and being Italian, they were on the side of the Germans, and so his time was limited in Africa, and he had to go. But he had made contact with Edel, and he'd seen the huge success that Edel had in starting the Legion in Africa. He was then sent back to Italy. He was then appointed as a nuncio to China in the 1940s, and he had seen what the Legion could do. So he arrived in China in the late 1940s, and he said, right, the communists are coming. We've got to start the Legion. He'd seen what Edel could do, and he said, well, look, because Edel had such success, we can do the same here. So he took on Father Aidan McGrath, who was an Irish priest in China at the time, and said, get started, get going. And they started in China, many thousands of presidia, and there were many thousands of Chinese martyrs for the faith as a result of that in the early 1950s. Now, all this is going on while Alfie Lambe is busy working in South America. So you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on here at the same time, and how the Holy Spirit is moving right across the globe. Extraordinary. So Edel Quinn, Monsignor Riberi would say, was responsible really for bringing the faith to China. And we look at China today, in the 1950s they reckon about 3 million Catholics, but now it's grown to many more, at least 10 million or more Catholics in China, in spite of the persecution that's still ongoing. So Edel died in Nairobi in 1944, and she was buried in the habit of the Sisters of the Precious Blood. So it was as if her religious vocation had finally been fulfilled. Here she was buried with the sisters. Alfie, likewise too, was buried in Buenos Aires in the cemetery attached to the Christian Brothers community out there. Remember how Alfie wanted to be a Christian brother? And then he's buried with the Christian Brothers in South America. And here Edel, buried with the religious sisters there in the missionaries' cemetery out there. So that's just a close-up there of Edel laid out in the sister's habit. And that's her tombstone there. And there she is buried with the other missionaries, the great missionary herself. And just to run through some of the biographies of Edel, which are well worth reading. That's one by Cardinal Sounens, written in 1952. It's a great story of Edel, and he was closest to her, I suppose, in a way, in terms of time, and he's a great writer. It's well worth picking up that biography. Frank Duff, too, wrote a great article on Edel Quinn, and he wrote later as well in the Maria Legionis, another article later on, 1977 there. Various other booklets and things. Marius McCarthy gave a talk on the interior life of Edel Quinn. This is a beautiful booklet, very short, well worth obtaining. It's written by a Carthusian nun by the name of Mary Walls. She was a friend of Edel's and a real close confidant of hers. And she and Edel used to get together regularly and speak very intimately in spiritual matters and their own spiritual lives. And she tells us the wonderful reading, the many books that Edel wrote to develop her spirituality and her deep relationship with Jesus, especially in the Holy Eucharist. It's a short little booklet, a very beautiful description of her interior life. Again, a couple of more biographies. This man, Father Anselm Moynihan, was the original vice postulator of Edel Quinn. He lived to quite an old age as well, himself a Dominican, a good friend of Father Bede McGregor, who's the vice postulator for Frank Duff at the moment. And Father McGregor told me that Father Moynihan, even on the day he died, he was working on Edel Quinn's cause. He was a great supporter of Edel Quinn. Dorian Cummins, another great legionary, wrote a beautiful booklet on Edel. Father Robert Bradshaw, himself a great legionary to Iceland and even to Russia, to Siberia. Father Bradshaw he wrote a booklet on Edel as well.